Hey, I'm Will Sarris. I'm a voice actor and the host of Storytime with Will and Revealed Connecticut on YouTube. And I'm also a P.T. Barnum enthusiast. So I am welcoming you to join us tonight for a fun-filled adventure back in time. So I got a question for you. Have you seen the film The Greatest Showman? If you haven't, it's streaming on Disney Plus. So go and check it out after you watch this video. But if you have already seen the film, I'm sure you're kind of curious about how accurate the movie actually is. And, was P.T. Barnum really like we saw Hugh Jackman portray him? So tonight, we're going to set the record straight. Just as a little bit of housekeeping, this program, as you heard from Lori, is being brought to you by the Quick Center for the Arts at Fairfield University and also by the Barnum Museum. Both are in Connecticut, if you're not familiar with Connecticut, and we're about an hour outside of New York City. The Quick Center and the Barnum Museum offer fascinating programs featuring performing artists, musicians, historians, authors, and they do it throughout the year normally to keep serving their many thousands of followers and subscribers. And they've partnered today to present an ongoing series of interesting, engaging, and maybe even a bit inspiring programs for you to sit back and enjoy. So to kick off the series tonight, we've got Barnum Museum's Executive Director, Kathleen Maher, who will present a fun-filled talk called The Greatest Showman, Fiction versus Fact, the real story behind the real story. Welcome, Kathy. How are you?
Hi, Will. Thank you. And Lori, thank you so much. This is fun. This has been a ride to get to tonight. We've been going back and forth. We've worked with the Quick Center before, so this is a whole new platform. I'm used to being there in person as well. But just to jump into the story, I've actually been at the Barnum Museum now 22 years. And in 2009, I got an email that there was an idea that Hugh Jackman wanted to create a movie about P.T. Barnum. And, that's interesting. So literally, we kind of followed periodically. There was some correspondence. We had some set designers come out, look at the Tom Thumb carriages, look at the artifacts. But it really wasn't until about a year before the movie was released. That was around Christmas in 2017 now, which I can't even believe. But they started really talking to us. They had already set the script. They didn't really consult with us about the historic accuracy of the film, and that's fine. But they were honest with us about it. So I had the absolute pleasure of going to the premiere. It was on the Queen Mary 2 in Brooklyn, and got to see the movie for the first time. And flooded, my inbox was flooded with people saying, "Did you see the movie? Is it accurate?" So from all of that, it inspired me and the staff here at the Barnum Museum to say, all right, kind of let's dissect the movie and come up with a fun program. The movie was so joyful. So tonight, this is sort of the condensed version that I'm going to do for you with some of the great images from the movie. We had to take out the trailer because it was too much drag technology. We all haven't caught quite up to technology, but I figure, let me introduce you to the film, The Greatest Showman, and align it with the fact versus the fiction, the real story behind the real story. So welcome everybody, sit back, relax, let's go. So what was true, what wasn't true? Fact is that Barnum was a remarkable 19th century visionary. He did so much more than what he is typically remembered. And hands down, Hugh Jackman is a dreamboat. I mean, that was probably the most questions I really got about the film. It's like, did you meet Hugh Jackman? Well, when the staff actually from 20th Century Fox, it was originally a 20th Century Fox film, came to us, they really wanted us to know ahead of time that they weren't making a documentary. This wasn't a documentary. What they were trying to do is capture Barnum's spirit, his zest for life, his zeal for life. And they did that. They did that extremely accurately. There's so much more to Barnum than what the 20th century thinks about and reflects on him. So just to go through some of these things that otherwise wouldn't be typical, hands down, the easiest thing I tell people all the time, hands down, the one thing that they absolutely did right was they both wore top hats. We have Barnum top hats. They're in the collection. Hugh Jackman wore them. That's probably about the most accurate thing that's in the film. The truth is, if you think about the film, Barnum is born in Bethel, Connecticut as a young boy. He's born very early. People put Barnum squarely in maybe the late 19th century into the 20th century. Barnum is actually born on July 5th, 1810. Now, if you think about what this country was like, what was happening in 1810, I always tell people Napoleon is still alive. Founding fathers are still alive. The Erie Canal is not open yet. This is raw country. So none of the defining principles that we think about today were in existence yet. They were emerging ideas and ideals. So he's born to a modest family. And then just to take you to the movie, this is wonderful. Ellis Rubin portrayed young Barnum in the film as a wonderful young actor. And he did a fantastic job. But the movie really starts out in New York City, probably in 1819, 1820. So Barnum would have only been 9 or 10 years old in these early scenes. And he's in New York City with his dad, and they're doing merchant work. The fact of the matter is Barnum was never in New York City with his dad. It was quite a journey from Bethel, Connecticut, all the way to New York. And at the end of that very first scene, you see them both running to catch the train. The train is not invented yet. It's too early. The engineering of the steam locomotive was starting to emerge in England, but by the time the train actually comes to Connecticut, it's 1833. Now, this doesn't make or break the story of the movie, but the train actually doesn't get up to Bethel, Connecticut, where he's from, or where he lived, until 1852. So right there were 40 years of technology. I mean, think about this moment in time and what was going on 40 years ago. We've got iPhones now. The things like that just didn't exist. Technology is like that. So it really kind of blurs the lines of how people existed in these early points in time. Now, I will also let you know too, if you saw the film, that the family looked like they were somewhat very poor. He was alone with his dad in the city. The fact of the matter is Barnum's maternal grandparents were actually rather wealthy. They owned a lot of the town of Bethel. And one of these little houses here is a shop that Barnum's dad and mother actually operated. So they weren't extremely well off. Now, the movie takes you down the path that, he loses his dad. That is actually true. Barnum's father dies when he's about 15. He's 15 years old. So he was certainly not an only child, which the film sort of suggests. And he was actually the 7th of 10 kids. Okay, so he was squarely, in the middle. His father's first wife passed away. His father remarried, so it was a whole brood of siblings and half siblings. So, but it was a pretty busy house. So he was not alone on the streets of New York City. Now they also show this wonderful scene about Charity. He meets Charity, their children. That is actually true. They do meet when they're teenagers, and they do fall in love. And there's a terrific scene of the two of them discovering this abandoned mansion. Now, again, this is somewhere around 1820. There really were no abandoned mansions in this country yet. And interestingly, so the mansion that they filmed it is the Woolworth building that's built in 1917. So it's 100 years later from what they actually, were living at that time. So the fascinating thing, and I pause because this is really the house that Barnum and Charity built after they were married. And there are some times when the truth is more insane than the fantasy. This is their house that was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, called Iranistan. It was modeled after the Brighton Pavilion, which is still in England now, in Brighton. It's a little bigger, but this is actually the house that they lived in from 1847 to 1857, when it unfortunately burned down. But this house is insanely more grand and spectacular than the Woolworth mansion that we saw in the movie, but who would believe a Ranistan? So just turning back the hands of time, some of the other things that makes any kind of historian, any kind of curator pause when you're looking at the scenes. Again, none of this impacted the joy of the film, just sit and enjoy it. But when you look really closely at some of the screen shots that they show you. This is one of the art direction pieces, and they're sketching out the Brooklyn Bridge in the background, and then they incorporate that with the big water tanks, Barnum and Charity getting married, dancing on the roof. I mean, fun scene, dancing on the roof of the buildings. And you can see, if you all can see, like a very faint skeleton of the beginning of the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance. Well, the truth of the matter is the Brooklyn Bridge is certainly there, but they didn't begin construction of the Brooklyn Bridge until 1869. So even though they married in 1829, again, it's decades of technology and advancements and innovation in the future from where Barnum and Charity actually lived. So this is what New York City actually looked like when Barnum and Charity lived there in the 1830s, 1840s. There are no water tanks. There are no bridges. The river is just filled with shipped vessels, and the streets were wide, and it was all carriages. So it was, New York really grew in an industrial way, not in a colonial way, the way we think of Boston or Philadelphia. But this is New York City in the 1840s. This is the skyline. Now they proceed into the movies. They created a wonderful family in New York City. Where was Barnum going to work? What was he going to do? How does his energy find its place in this emerging metropolis in New York City? So interestingly, they show that she's pregnant. Their first daughter, Caroline, was actually born in Connecticut, and she's born in Bethel. But what really happens too, they decide to move. So their daughter is in Connecticut. But what happens with Barnum's Connecticut business is he was operating a general store. He was actually a lottery agent. He was making a lot of money. Lotteries were sanctioned by the church and by the state in the 1830s, and Connecticut changed legislation, and he couldn't make the same amount of money to really carry on his life and raise his family the way he wanted to. That's why they actually moved to New York City. This is a little side note too. A lot of people always ask us, oh, his daughter, was she really a ballet dancer? Well, in New York in 1840, there was no such thing as ballet. It's important to realize the context of society at any given time when you start talking about individual lives. The American Ballet Theater isn't established really until 1937. And New York City Ballet is 1948. I mean, this is just an extraordinary amount of time. There were no recitals where little girls were dancing ballet. Nobody knew exactly what that was in this country, unless you were traveled, unless you were the educated or the elite classes who might have gone to the continent and had this exposure in France, in England. It didn't exist in this country. Theater going was predominantly attended by male audiences. There was violence, there was ill behavior. It was not a place for women and children. So where do you go for that? So Barnum actually brings, in the 1850s, 1860s, ballerinas to the American Museum as part of his curiosities. So this is when everybody tells me I'm a total buzzkill. I'm like the Neil deGrasse Tyson of like the history museum world. It was like, you gotta be kidding. There was no ballet. It's the truth. Feel free to tweet it. But history is a remarkable thing. So this is Barnum's family looking at this picture in the film. He's with his wife is Charity. They've got their 2 daughters. So this is what the movie Barnum family actually looks like on opening day, New Year's Day, 1842. So the fact is that Barnum had 4 daughters. One did not survive beyond 2 years old. Sadly, she passed away. And Barnum's favorite daughter, Pauline, doesn't even factor into the movie. And there's a big age gap. When the American Museum opened, Caroline was already 9 years old and Helen was only 2. So the family dynamic was a little different. And just so I want to introduce you to Charity, Barnum's first wife. She tolerated him. Here we have a portrait in the museum's collection of the real Charity, and this is our real Charity. Beautiful flowing blonde hair, not so much the style. It was just so far from anything that would have been typical fashion in the 1840s. And that was pretty oddly consistent with the women costuming at the time. So now, what the film also wants you to believe is he opens the American Museum and he renames it Barnum Circus. And that just completely didn't happen. The idea of the circus happened significantly later, in the 1870s. And by the time The Greatest Show on Earth, the idea of the circus happens, Charity has passed away and Barnum marries the daughter of a friend who's 40 years younger, Nancy Fish, who they stayed together until he passes away in 1891. But Charity doesn't really ever get to see The Greatest Show on Earth and what that did through the decades. This is what the Barnum family looked like when The Greatest Show on Earth actually opened, when the idea of the circus opened. There were, in the green circle, that's his actual wife, who was about the age of his daughters. So they're my age when the show opens. There are grandchildren, there are sons-in-law. It's a big family at that time. So none of that wife, 2 daughters, that small nuclear family, that just simply wasn't the case. Again, doesn't ruin, the story of the movie. What they did get really kind of right in a fun way, if you're looking at the image, the black and white image, that is actually a photograph about 1850 of the American Museum. That's Broadway and Ann Street, way downtown. And they tried in the movie to create the vibrancy, the color, the fact that there were paintings and pictures and all types of, images on the building. Barnum had bands outside. So that actually they got really right. And even in the colorful print, that is Jenny Lind slaying in the city. So you see her in the foreground. And what they wanted to do was create that energy and that excitement. And in the movie, they're trying to do that because that was true. There were just hundreds of thousands, turned out to be millions of people that visited the American Museum during the course of its life. So they did capture that energy. Now, when they enter, Charity for the first time, they enter the American Museum. It's this circular rotunda-like setting, not quite so much. The American Museum was already an established museum for sciences and education, similar to Peale's museum at that time. And it was a cabinet of curiosities. This is kind of more like what you would have seen if you went to the American Museum, specimens. Nothing delineated a museum at that time. It wasn't like you're going to go to the Met and see the artwork and the Museum of Natural History and see the anthropological experiences. It wasn't like that. It was a hodgepodge of everything. This is the emergence of the public museum. Athenaeums existed, but they were not necessarily for everybody. The doors were not open for everybody. It wasn't promoted that way. Barnum basically takes this idea, creates a brochure where you can go. And these are illustrations from what the inside of the American Museum looked like. There were wax figures, there were biological specimens alongside artworks. And you could get this calendar and go through floor by floor by floor. A lot of people don't realize that the American Museum is the first aquarium in this country. The aquarium opened in London in 1852. Barnum opened the aquarium in the American Museum in 1856. So he really owns that. He actually even owned what today is the Boston Aquarium, the New England Aquarium. It was Barnum's Aquarial Gardens. So it was always going back to a museum enterprise industry for him. And he coins the expression, a lot of people in my industry say, oh, edutainment. Barnum was using instructive entertainment as his mission going all the way back to the 1840s. So here we are today doing the same thing. It was a place for family amusement. The idea of family entertainment was finally taking grip, and it was the American Museum that brought that to the table. So a fun thing too, a lot of people always ask, it's like, well, who is Phillip Carlisle? And there's no Phillip Carlisle in anything. And I've been reading this for a long time. And I said, well, what was the Phillip Carlisle idea? And interestingly, when you look at the stories that the movie touched on, he's just, they always said, it's just like it's an amalgam of a whole bunch of influential people in Barnum's life. You know, Horace Greeley was his best friend. You know, John Greenwood was a trusted colleague from Bethel. He knew he could run the museum. And then you get into the circus proprietors, James Bailey. So you roll them all up together and poof, you got a Zac Efron. It's a Phillip Carlisle. So he was just a combination of a whole bunch of different characters. And interestingly, as I thought about it too, the character James Gordon Bennett, who was the antagonist, he was probably the most accurate character in the entire movie. They were adversaries from 1835, and they stuck with it. It's almost as if it was that dynamic relationship. You always need that person to push you because you could push back, and they went at it all the time through the course of their lives. And I got to tell you, if you just look at these two pictures, you tell me that that casting is not extraordinary if this guy isn't reincarnated from James Bennett. But it was the truer part of the movie, was this antagonistic relationship that they had. So the one thing that I like to tell people is the word humbug has been used so differently through the course of time. Barnum's actual definition, his 19th century definition of humbug, is, in my opinion, the true meaning of humbug is management, tact, to take an old truth and put it in an attractive form. And that was his objective for the museum, always trying to find something new, a new way to tell a story. That was his goal and objective every day. And the more I thought about the movie, and I don't know if you can all see me, but a book was actually written about the making of the film. And the production designer, Nathan Crawley, actually writes, this is his quote: "Audiences like to feel they're seeing something new when something is actually old, but we've just redone it to give us a different look." And not as eloquently said, but that's exactly it. This is sort of a modern humbug. They were taking this old story and modernizing it for the sensibilities of audiences today. So I kind of give them a pass. They were honest about it. They were authentic about what their intention was. It was to capture Barnum's spirit. Now, there are some things that's really hard to get around. I love the scene of Barnum and Phillip Carlisle in the bar, beautifully choreographed, a lot of fun, and they're shooting shots back, and okay. But for me, I'm sitting there going, holy moly. The fact is that the bar was supposed to be across the street. When the production company called us, we're creating Barnum Arms. Can you help us? What does it look like across the street? And I'm like, Barnum Arms? And she goes, yeah, Barnum's bar, his saloon across the street from the museum. And it was like, okay, it's St. Paul's Church across the street from the American Museum. St. Paul's Church is still there, which is wonderful. And the truth of the matter is, Barnum was one of the country's leading temperance champions at that time. Signed this teetotaler pledge, cut heads off his bottles of wine, donated thousands of dollars to the cause, even created the liquor laws in the state of Connecticut up until a few years ago. He was adamant that there was no drinking or smoking in his American Museum because there were no regulations. If you wanted to drink or you wanted to smoke, you had to leave and pay full price to get back in. Outside the Moral Lecture Hall was the teetotaler pledge, and women are dragging their husbands to sign the pledge. So he walked the walk. So seeing him in that sort of environment, it's kind of like, ooh, I don't know how we would have liked that, because it was one of his absolute dying, charges. He even writes this quote we have: "The real key to misery is whiskey." And he writes that in 1865. So I think that he would have been less than excited about that particular interpretation of him. Now, the fact of the matter is, the American Museum was huge. At any given point, there were close to 800,000 exhibits on display. And it's estimated that about 38 million people went to visit the American Museum. This is at a time when the population of this country was only about 32 million. So it was really the first major global attraction. Barnum is actually in the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions Hall of Fame for creating the attractions industry. And he's next to Walt Disney and Roy Disney and Milton Hershey. He has seen, with the American Museum, not the greatest show on earth, as the creator of the attractions industry because of this innovation, the brilliance that he had to create something for all audiences. Now, a lot of people ask, it's always a go-to about the performers. Well, with 800,000 exhibits that people can see, the performers, the marvels of nature, were a small part of, really a small part of the American Museum. There were performers, there were levees, you could engage. What Barnum actually did too, which is rather fun, was even bring families over from different countries. It wasn't like anybody could, hop the Atlantic Ocean and go to Germany or Scandinavia, whatever it was. So Barnum would hire families to come and be in their traditional clothing and their music and their songs and their language. So he was bringing the world to the American Museum to engage the audiences. And today, if you ever go to Epcot and you go to the World Showcase, everybody that works in those pavilions is from a different country. So in a funny kind of way, it was a form of early Epcot. So this is actually a photograph of some of the actual performers. Anna Swan, the giant lady, Casacan Beauties, the giants. So it is a family. There's people that actually lived at the museum. They were paid, they were boarded. But the one thing I can tell you for sure, never, ever did Barnum wear a red sparkly jacket, get in front of the audience. He was the greatest attraction. He was his own greatest attraction. People wanted to see Barnum. That is written about very often. But never was he a ringmaster. People think that he did that. He was a brilliant business person. He had an extraordinary acumen. He understood promotion before advertising was even invented. Now, what's interesting too, speaking of the performers, there were performers, among the most famous were the Siamese twins, Chang and Ang. Chang and Ang were actually, long before they worked with Barnum, they were actually their own celebrities. They had their own tour, they traveled around, they did quite well for themselves. And they refused to work for Barnum. Barnum actually had to have wax figures of them made and put in the museum because they just weren't interested in signing a contract. So interestingly, and this would be a whole nother talk, Chang and Ang married sisters. Between them, they had 22 children. And apparently they were very intelligent children. They needed to raise tuition money. They signed a contract and worked for Barnum for only 6 weeks. That's it. So everybody goes back and thinks that Barnum created these people who were already working. They were talented. This was the profession at that time. There were many bearded ladies, not just one. I always look at Mrs. Myers here and I always like, really? But, I'm not, who am I to judge? But there were many bearded ladies that worked with the American Museum at any given time. And then another interesting character, these are actually people. This was the Lucchese family. And again, they had performances in Amsterdam. They were very popular in Europe and traveled around, and Barnum hired them for a brief period of time in 1857 to come to the American Museum for a showcase, and they did. There was no tents. We think of the circus today, there were aerial acts, and yes, absolutely. Mademoiselle Victoria dazzled crowds in the Moral Lecture Room. Everything was rigged, but it wasn't a big circus tent with multiple rings at that time at all. But I think the unfortunate, what they missed in the movie was the extraordinary relationship between Barnum and Tom Thumb. Tom Thumb's real name, Tom Thumb is a stage name. His real name is Charles Stratton. And he was actually born in Bridgeport. Barnum's brother heard about him. Barnum came to Bridgeport, met Charles, met the Stratton family, and he was a child star. He could sing, he could dance, he was engaging. And in the film, they show him as an adult. And that's just simply not the case. Charles was only 5 years old when they actually met, and he negotiated a contract to perform in Europe, and that is actually what they did. So they, and in the film, they show the whole company goes to England. That also didn't happen. It was really just Barnum and Charles and his parents and his tutor for a number of years. So Barnum was away for many years on this tour, which really became the sensation. It's quite easy to argue that Tom Thumb is the first international rock star, and on his own, he made millions of dollars, and they stayed friends through the course of their entire lives. It's actually, there's wonderful stories about the fact that Charles was really like the son Barnum never had, to the point where they are buried literally across from each other at Mountain Grove Cemetery here in Bridgeport. I mean, to the end. There was a beautiful story there that they just could have gotten. It could have embraced that. So the other story that really, this is the story that made me go, what? So the whole Jenny Lind thing, and I'm very familiar with the Jenny Lind story, and I happened to know Jenny Lind's great-great-granddaughter who was in England. And the one thing that is absolutely a fact, there's no question, as I was saying earlier, there was no such thing as opera in this country. Nobody, unless, again, you were part of the educated or the elite, or you had traveled, would you have understood what opera was. The masses just had no idea. So Barnum, having been in Europe with Tom Thumb, heard about Jenny Lind, and he felt that a tour of this level of performance would elevate American society. Now, it's important to also realize that by 1850 in this country, people were desiring different types of fashionable tastes that they could incorporate. So taking European styles, making them American. Now, this was the perfect time. If there couldn't have been a better time in society to embrace Jenny Lind, it was now. And Barnum did realize that he had to work to prepare the public, to accept this. How am I going to sell an opera singer? Even a conductor on a train once says, Jenny Lind, what is she, a dancer? And he was like, oh my God. He put $167,000 in a banking house before she would even pack a petticoat. So he invested, and this is 1850, this is millions of dollars. So the contract was set. She was going to make $1,000 per performance, up to $150,000. She actually made more. Barnum was to assume all the expenses. The movie sort of got that right. But Barnum billed Jenny, and this is the quote, "She's a friend to humanity who regards her high artistic power as a gift from heaven, and whose every thought and deed is philanthropy. I feel persuaded will prove a blessing to America." Okay, isn't that beautiful? And that's what captivated people, not this. When I saw the buzz, I was like, no. I was actually compelled to reach out to Jenny's granddaughter and just give her the forewarning. She was like, oh my goodness, it's absolutely implausible. And it was kind of is. So the Jenny Lind story was probably the wrongest, we'll use that as a word, there could possibly have been. The truth is that after 9 months of constant engagement, they were traveling on trains at that point. There were trains, coaches. They were on a ship called the Gladiator that they thought was lost at sea. I mean, this is an opera singer. Who would travel this way today? They were exhausted. They were all exhausted. And Jenny fell in love with her accompanist, Otto Goldschmidt. So they amicably terminated the contract. Speculation goes on and on, but Jenny and Otto stayed in this country. They married in Boston, which is lovely. But when you change your billing from the divine Jenny Lind to Frau Otto Goldschmidt, it sort of loses the romance. And that's what happened. But it certainly defined Barnum, as America's first impresario. It set a new tone. They had to build buildings to house the tens of thousands of people that wanted to hear her because he was a genius at promotion. And believe it or not, Jenny Lind Hall was renamed the Metropolitan Opera House. So here it is. You know, he has his tentacles in almost everything. So just to take it to the beginning, there was no proven relationship. There was no, no kiss on stage, no incriminating anything. His marriage didn't bring it. There was no flash photography. And just as a little side note, in that big scene you see at the end with the spotlight on him, okay, Edison doesn't invent the spotlight until 1911. So there's none of that technology that makes it sensational, because Barnum just doesn't fit. This is what the lecture hall looked at like at the American Museum. It was a place for refinement. It was elegant. It was lit. The prosceniums were painted. Things were gilded. It was a very prominent place to be seen and to see moral theater. So this is what the movie shows us, as if that whole circus was part of the component. And it finally dawned on me, because Hugh Jackman is from Australia, the production people that were actually from England, they weren't looking at American forms. They were actually looking at Philip Astley's amphitheater from 1768 to draw on this stylistic production of the film. They were looking at European models. They weren't looking actually at what America was doing. They could have called, but we sort of figured it out that they weren't coming from an American historical perspective. And again, that was fine. But by the time you get to 1874, now we're already on decades-long journey, that's when you really see the first time the greatest show. Barnum's Hippodrome, where there were chariot races, there were pageants, looks more like where they were really starting the film, some 60 years into Barnum's life. And interestingly, I'm compelled to point out, Barnum leased a trolley barn from Vanderbilt on Madison, the corner of Madison and 26th Street. So he had a permanent home for the greatest show on earth. It was the Hippodrome, and it was renamed Madison Square Garden. So a lot of people don't realize that Barnum really was responsible for creating the entertainment venue that today is Madison Square Garden. If he didn't do that, that would have been where probably Grand Central would be today. So this is just for my friends that enjoy costume. Charity would have certainly worn something on the left. That's very 1850s, leading into 1860s. And what the movie Charity is wearing is like something I would have worn to my friend Glenn's 60th birthday party. I don't know what they were thinking with costume, but boy, oh boy, not even close on that, which is fine. And then just to get to the fire, the fact is, yes, there was a fire. The American Museum did burn down, which was a tragedy. Everybody was saved. They lost animals, but no lives were lost. And then in the film, they were showing, I was sitting there watching, and they were like, "Oh no, don't run into the building." And it's like, oh no, they run him into the burning building. Yeah, the fire was not started by a bigoted mob, and Barnum did not go running into the building. That's just not the case. Fact of the matter is that even the New York Herald reported that it is suspected that Southern sympathizers burnt the American Museum down. It was on a hit list for arson, because Barnum was such a prominent and vocal voice for emancipation during the Civil War. And it was just a recognizable statement that they could make and get attention. So sadly, the American Museum burned down. Interestingly, where Barnum was when he found out, Barnum was on the floor of the Connecticut General Assembly as a legislator for the town of Fairfield, taking down Vanderbilt and the railroad schemes, when a slip of paper was handed to him that the American Museum was gone. Infinitely more interesting story. And it took them over a day, of course, to get from Hartford all the way down to downtown. So it was sad. Now, one of his best friends was Horace Greeley. And it was Horace Greeley who said to him, "Look, you've gone through enough. Take this fire as a sign, my friend, and go a-fishing." So Barnum says, like, maybe it's just time to retire, and he just talk about type A personality. He exhausts me. He's been dead for over 100 years. But Barnum decided to go out west. It's westward expansion. Let me see the world, this country. He's been all over Europe. So he does. He travels west. And that's when he meets circus promoters in Delavan, Wisconsin, who actually say to him, we could use your name. You've created a brand. The Barnum brand now exists. And if we can start a traveling circus show and use your name. And Barnum actually says, he goes, you know what? That would revive my love of my museums. And he actually decides, let's do this. And they combine sources, and you can see just even on the ticket, it's P.T. Barnum's Broadway American Museum and Menagerie and Dan Casello's Mammoth Circus. So it's never just a circus. Barnum always wanted his museums to be part of the forefront. So they couldn't take the show, to Manhattan. They had to open the show in Brooklyn, which is perfectly fine. April 10th, 1871, Greatest Show on Earth opens. And the reason they had it open in Brooklyn is because Barnum leased his name to another museum proprietor in Manhattan at that time, and there was a non-compete clause, so they had to open in Brooklyn. So there it is. And just as an aside, I always thought this was kind of funny that they put skyscrapers in the distance. Yeah, no, just simply not the case. But this is just kind of fun. You don't have to read all this, please. But this is just the names, the list of names that the show actually was titled at any given time. In 1887 is my favorite. P.T. Barnum and Company's Greatest Show on Earth and Great London Circus combined, a traveling school of universal knowledge. I'd want to go see that. You just have to see it. So it's not until 1887, for the first time, he shares title with James Bailey. He meets James Bailey in the 80s, and he said, somebody finally with steel of my own. And he sees it as, he refers to it as the Great Alliance. So in the end of the movie, when they say, oh, we're going to do it, they did that wonderful ceremonial passing of the top hat. Barnum is a young man, his daughters haven't aged at all. Fact of the matter is, Barnum never retired. He dies in 1891. And he had an office at Madison Square Garden until he died. And it's reported that some of his last words, he wanted to know what the receipts were at the garden for the show that day. So until the end, he was involved and he was engaged and active. So this is a poster, and actually it's behind me, of the long and busy, the scenes from a long and busy life. It's a wonderful piece in the collection, and it tells all the stories that Barnum wanted people to remember him by. And the movie was an hour and 40, that's about an hour and 45 minutes long. And what it did was it compressed 70 years of his life into this very digestible movie. So points for them, not an easy thing to do, but 70 years, so much happened. He lost his wife, he lost his daughters. It was a life of struggles and triumphs. And that is actually the name of his autobiography, where you haven't heard it from me, you could hear it from him. But the one thing that is absolutely certain, we are very fortunate to have an extraordinary collection. And one of the autograph books that we have, Barnum in his own handwriting wrote, "The noblest art is that of making others happy." And this film certainly did that. And we're so grateful to 20th Century Fox and Hugh Jackman for that. So I'm looking at the time so we can get into Q&A, but the question that I get asked more than anything is, yes, I actually did have a chance to meet Hugh Jackman. So there it is. We have evidence of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the powers that be, but I want to thank the Quick Center so much for having us, certainly 20th Century Fox, now Disney Plus, for letting us share this story. And it was a pleasure.
That's awesome, Kathy. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I just want to say really quickly to all the people that are watching, if you want to ask a question, there's a comment section on Facebook, and I believe on the Quick Center Live and wherever else you're watching. Please ask us a question and it'll get to us. And if we can't answer it now, somebody should be on various social media sites to be able to answer that for you in the future. And then I also wanted to just say quickly, please do not forget to support the Barnum Museum and the Quick Center financially during this time. One of the reasons that we're doing this is because they really do need the support. So you can see that, and you can donate to the Barnum at barnum-museum.org/donate. And the Quick Center also has a donation page as well. So Kathy, I have a couple of questions. Are you ready?
I'm always ready.
Okay. So it struck me as I was listening to what you were saying, when you mentioned Iranistan and Madison Square Garden and some of the other things that, if I go into Bridgeport now, I can drive down Iranistan Avenue and I can go see a Madison Square Garden. What else is there around that are things that Barnum had a hand in that we don't know about anymore, or that we don't associate with him anymore? And why do you think that he's kind of somewhat forgotten from kind of the public consciousness?
So I have a brilliant answer to that, and it's actually not my answer. If anybody's familiar with John Strassbaugh from the New York Times, we did a number of years ago now, one of the New York explorers, and we kind of walked Barnum's footsteps way downtown. We went to Grace Church, where Tom Thumb and Lavinia Warren were married. We went to Castle Garden, where Jenny Lind sang, and we talked about it. I was like, how is it that his actual history has become so much mythology, and there's so much inaccuracy, when somebody like Walt Disney, not so much. I mean, how you have these kind of icons. And John summed it up perfectly. He basically said, Barnum died. There was nobody there to hold up his legacy. He was the one who masterfully calculated every step, every way he wanted to proceed. He controlled all of it. And when he died, he didn't have anybody there to take up that reign. So interestingly, I'm very fortunate. I've met, if there are any Disney folks out there, Marty Sklar and Jack Lundquist, some of these legends that worked with Disney. What I learned was, after Walt Disney passed away, there were turf wars. It wasn't like, oh, it's a happy place, it was like my happy place that you just, all the pieces fit together. There were battles about what's the name, how is this going to proceed. It was pretty combative from the account that I heard from Marty. And basically, when they finally all agreed, there's one name on the door, and it's Walt Disney. Everybody was able to come under that umbrella. And I always think of it that way. But no, you're absolutely right. Barnum is really not seen as an influencer the way we live with. I mean, every time you see an advertisement, I mean, he's the father of modern advertising. He thought of these things. But a couple of things that people don't associate with him, and this is kind of my favorite. Many people probably watching are familiar with Tufts University. Barnum is a founding member of Tufts University. He is still on their trustee list, 1852, I believe it is. And now that you're thinking about that, their mascot is the Jumbos.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah, he donated Barnum Hall. He created the Natural Science Museum at Tufts University, which sadly burnt down. And I always forget, it's 1975 or 1978. Jumbo's ashes were scooped up into a peanut butter jar. That's still there. But he is a founding member of Tufts. He was a Universalist. So that was the charge at that time. He truly did believe in education. But yeah, Madison Square Garden is a big one. But Barnum actually donated, and maybe some folks have even seen it. He was a donor to the museum, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. That opens also 20 something years after Barnum's American Museum was opened and laid the groundwork. But Barnum donated the skeletal assembly to the Museum of Natural History, and I believe they've got it in conservation right now. He donated to, oh my goodness, he was a big collector to the National Zoo, was a founding member of the National Zoo. And so there's quite a bit that people don't realize that he was really a major influence on.
Wow. Yeah. So Kathy, I've got a question from one of our viewers. And this sort of, I guess, kind of goes in with another question that was asked. And it begins with kind of two things. One is, was Barnum a poor kid from Bethel? And then did he adopt kind of polished speech and manners after that? So I guess the two questions are, did he change, but was he really a poor kid from Bethel in the first place?
So it's like we talked about earlier, he wasn't a poor kid. He was a very middle-class kid. It was a farming community. It was barter, it was trade. So he lived that existence. As he realized that, you know, agrarian life was not him, you know, he needed something more to suit his sensibilities. And he was actually extremely bright from all accounts, that he knew he had to get out of Bethel. There was something else for him. You know, his path was not that. And he carried forward really a sense of Yankee ingenuity. All of those lessons he learned from barter and trade was part of his Yankee, you know, his Yankee upbringing. And that he talks about, the universal Yankee, of which I am a proud member of, his words paraphrased, but he does bring that forward into every measure of his life, whether he was entertaining for the Queen or meeting the presidents, whatever it was, he knew where he came from. And interestingly, also, you know, when he made all of his wealth, his great wealth was certainly in the 1840s and into the 1850s. He's actually trying his hands at developing. He was trying to create, you know, East Bridgeport. And what actually happens is he gets entangled with a bad investment, the Jerome Clock Company debacle, and he goes completely broke. He loses all of his money, which is terrible. People were trying to give him charity. He wouldn't take the charity. He had to find a way back. They mortgaged the American Museum. He put property in charity's name. And it was when Tom Thumb finally says to him, come on, old friend, let's go back, you know, abroad, manage my tour. Let's get you back on your feet. So his friend, you know, came to really his rescue. And he actually started giving lectures in Europe called The Art of Money Getting. There just thousands of people would come. And interestingly, he was like, I'm broke. I'm here because I'm broke. What do you want to see me? And the idea of a self-made millionaire will always be a millionaire. So students at Oxford wanted to hear Barnum, you know, the great Barnum. So interestingly, when Barnum reflects, it takes years to get his feet back underneath him, purchase back the American Museum and start up again. He reflects back that he needed that lesson. That was a divine lesson to help him find humility in life, to help him recognize the things that were really important in life and not to be so fully and completely consumed by business operations. And he writes about that rather extensively, that, you know, this was his needed experience so he could be better and a more giving person. And so he walked with humility in life and gratitude, and always over his fireplace, his motto was actually love God and be merry.
That's a good motto. I like that motto. You actually answered another one of the questions, which was about whether Stratton came to rescue Barnum. So that's good. Did intellectuals or polite society accept him and socialize with him?
It depended. Absolutely depended. There were, he was friendly with Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, and they could have a terrific relationship. And sometimes, you know, it's Mark Twain, you know, he what he wants, but they absolutely knew each other, supported each other when they needed to. You know, Twain wrote the ghost story, and actually supposedly Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. You know, is that Camelot? No, that's Bridgeport. It's supposedly, you know, a little reflective of Barnum. But like I said, Prince Albert frequented the American Museum, had no problem with, you know, mingling with crown heads of state, you know, or the shopkeepers in town. So he was really a Renaissance, you know, character at the time. He really was. We just last week corresponded with a descendant, goes all the way back to 17th century Barnums. And this particular woman was visiting a Welsh bed and breakfast a number of years ago. And when the proprietor said, your name is Barnum, I have these letters and in journals from the family going back to the 1870s. One of the proprietor's fathers was like traveling in the US, was on a train in Chicago and meets P.T. Barnum, and the letters just went on about what a delightful experience it was to be on the train. And I'm like, I gotta find that letter, you know, so she's helping us track it down. So people recall him better during his time than people reflect on him today, interestingly.
Interesting. I don't think we have too much more time, so I want to get to two kind of questions. Not really so much questions, but I wanted you to comment a little bit on the museum now. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's going on with the museum? Because I know obviously it's not open due to COVID, but it's actually been kind of in an interesting place for a little while. And then is there anywhere that we can go to learn more about PT?
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's so kind. Yeah. So, so the Barnum, for those of you that don't know, in 2010, the historic building got hit with an EF1 tornado. 2011, we got hit with Hurricane Irene. And then in 2012, we got slammed by Superstorm Sandy. So why not throw a global pandemic on top of that? So we've been navigating out of multiple disasters for a really long time, nothing that I ever thought was going to be on my obituary, but here I am. But we've been working with a firm called BRC Imagination Arts to re-envision the Barnum Museum, create a museum Barnum would have created, and we're excited about that. So we're still moving forward. And for Connecticut, construction did not shut down during COVID. So the repairs of the historic building have continued. Drawings are being reviewed right now by the State Historic Preservation Office. So that's a good thing. But as far as the public coming in, we're challenged by the regulations that absolutely have to be enforced to protect, you know, the staff, to protect the volunteers and the guests. We get a lot of guests from out of state, and it's a little difficult to manage which states are on the quarantine lists and how do you police it. So, and then the expense, we would have to dismantle exhibitions, and it's thousands of dollars to do that. So we're looking at a reopening of the gallery sometime around New Year's. And that's pretty consistent with a lot of Connecticut sites. We don't have grounds outside, so we couldn't open up outside. It's all private property. This is a really urban museum. So we're doing things like this, which we hope more and more people will. But yes, we are continuing to raise money for our appeal. So please, whatever you can donate, we would love it. It would be fantastic. And if you're not near us, don't forget the arts and the theaters and the museums in your local neighborhoods. I know people are watching this from all different places. Arts and culture need help now, all of them. And if you can think of them as part of America's culture, how do you move forward? When you think about history, what remains? It's the artwork, it's the stories, it's the things that, you know, are unearthed. It's not the spreadsheets. You know, I hate to say it. So we define ourselves through our arts and our imaginations and the stories that we leave behind. So that's critical, you know, to us and our humanity. So,
yeah, that's so true. All right, well, let's close up. Thank you very much for watching today. Thank you, Kathy, for this really interesting talk. And I know we're going to do another one with some other people. We've got some great options coming up, some great speakers coming up. Again, please, if you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook, please like, subscribe, do whatever you can to get more information about the Barnum Museum and also for the Quick Center for the Arts. And if you can make a charitable donation to either the Quick Center or the Barnum or both, please do so. Again, you can find information about that on their website. And you know what? This is Will and Kathy, and we're signing off, and have a really great and safe rest of the evening.
thank you, everyone. Stay well.